that we learn as adults is through conversation. So I love that this talk takes place as a conversation. Leading our conversation here today is Julie McGee, who is Associate Professor of Africana Studies and Art History, as well as the Director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center at the University of Delaware. Dr. McGee is an art historian with specialties in African American art and also contemporary African art, specifically South African art, which she's published widely on. She's been at the University of Delaware for quite a while, first in the museums, and now is a professor. And I'm delighted to have her here, as well as our distinguished scholar and artist, Dr. David Driscoll. So, thank you.
We didn't do a sound check yet, so. How do you turn them on? Sure. So welcome and thank you for coming. I have the honor of providing a brief introduction to David Driscoll because the point of today's gathering is really for you to hear from him. So it's very hard to write a short introduction, but I've done my best. And I'm going to start first by thanking Heather for introducing us and the Delaware Art Museum for hosting our conversation today, which coincides with, as she mentioned, and celebrates the opening of Posing Beauty in African American Culture, an exhibition curated by artist and scholar Deborah Willis. Dr. Willis and our guest today, Dr. David Driscoll, are both creative practitioners and cultural visionaries of indomitable spirit. For them, making art is also making art history. And our time today, we will focus on the activist curating and curating as activism of David Driscoll. Today's conversation is part of the Living Legacy National Speaking Tour arranged by the Driscoll Center and supported by generous donation from Dr. Larry and Dr. Brenda Thompson. Established in 2001, the David C. Driscoll Center, which you see a slide of here, honors the achievements and the contributions of David Driscoll as an artist, art historian, collector, curator, and philanthropist to the rich heritage of African American visual arts and its history and culture. Located at the University of Maryland, College Park, the Driscoll Center is committed to preserving, documenting, exhibiting, as you see here, and here the current exhibition up at the Driscoll Center, exhibiting African American art, and also committed to the longue durée of replenishing and expanding the field. And I do want to say that most of these slides that have images in it today are courtesy of the David C. Driscoll papers that are part of the archives at the University of Maryland College Park, or courtesy of David C. Driscoll's studio. Trained as a painter and art historian, David C. Driscoll works primarily in collage and mixed media. His works are included in major private and public collections across the United States. He has maintained an active career as a practicing artist, teacher, curator, arts administrator, and art consultant for more than 60 years. As Heather says, artists age well. An internationally recognized scholar and curator, he has lectured worldwide on African American art, and his numerous exhibitions and many of their catalogs on the subject of African American art, now collector's items, have shaped the field as we know it today. David Driscoll is the recipient of numerous awards, fellowships, and prizes, including 3 Rockefeller Foundation Fellowships and the Harman Foundation Fellowship. In 1976, Driscoll curated the groundbreaking exhibition for the Los Angeles Museum of Art, 2 Centuries of Black American Art, 1750 to 1950, which shored up a foundation for the field of African American art history. This exhibition and others, and Driscoll's trajectory from his college years to today, are the subject of our conversation. His educational and administrative career took him to 3 HBCUs, and lastly, in 1977, to the University of Maryland, College Park. Named Distinguished University Professor of Art in 1995, he retired, a term I use loosely, in 1998. He was presented with the National Humanities Medal by President William Jefferson Clinton in 2000, and in 2005, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta established the David C. Driscoll Prize, the first national award to honor and celebrate contributions to the field of African American art and art history. In addition to numerous honorary doctoral degrees, including one from where I work, the University of Delaware, Driscoll is an elected national academician, one of the highest honors in American art, and an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2016, he received the Lifetime Legacy Award from the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine, one of the states he calls home. It truly takes a village to appropriately honor all that David Driscoll has given to all of us. A major survey exhibition devoted to his painting from 1952 today will begin its U.S. tour in February 2021. The exhibition and accompanying catalog is co-sponsored by the High Museum of Art, the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, in cooperation with the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. So please join me in welcoming David Driscoll to the show. You will notice that I have some slides that actually have newspaper articles in them. They're not meant for you to read them, so don't squint trying to figure out what the text is. It's really just a prompt, and the headline is actually the most important. So here, I brought a newspaper article that says it's an artist who feels responsible to promote African American art, and then is an article that was about ostensibly this exhibition, narratives of African American art and identity, that was a traveling exhibition of David Driscoll's own collection of African American art. So much of what we'll talk about today will be related to how David came to be the person who felt a responsibility, took on that responsibility, and how it has helped us shape the field of American art and become a foundation for the study of African American art. So we're going to begin, and probably what's most important here is, because we're going to start at Howard University, is that it was there where, quote, I'm going to quote you if you don't mind, "My teachers impressed upon me that collecting art was an affirmation of one's own participation in his or her own culture." So how did David Driscoll, from Eatonton, Georgia, living in North Carolina, end up at Howard University?
Well, I will shorten the story because it's a long one. I attended a little four-room segregated high school in Appalachia, Western North Carolina, and had to ride 35 miles every day there, 35 miles back. On the way, we would go past about 4 big, beautiful edifices for the white students. Couldn't attend because of our race. But we had very good teachers who said to us, you must go to college. And buttressed by what my father and mother said, because we were sharecroppers. And then finally my father saved enough money to buy a little farm. And I said, no, I'm not going to be a farmer. And my father said the way out of this is through education. And so he kind of stamped that impression into my mind, beginning with my studies in the 5th grade. He was also a Baptist minister. He had been a Methodist minister, but there were no African Methodist Episcopal churches in the area in Appalachia where I grew up. And, you know, Methodist people are very particular about their denominations. And since there was no AME church nearby, he joined the Baptist church. And he became a minister in that area. But it was like saying college is the ultimate. And attending this little four-room school. As I said, we had very, very fine teachers. One of the products of segregation in the South in those days was that the black teachers, obviously they couldn't attend school at the major white institutions, state institutions like the University of North Carolina, not even the private schools like Duke, what have you. But the state would pay them to go out of the state wherever anybody would accept them. And so we had fourth grade teachers who had master's degrees from Columbia, from University of Michigan, and schools like that. So in a certain way we felt superior, and we were, because we had really good teachers. And they encouraged us. They said, you must go to college. So out of that class of 24 people in that little segregated school, 18 of us went off to college. And I had planned to go to Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. I had a little scholarship. And the night before, time to go, I announced that I'm going to Howard University. And my parents, were kind of taken back, and everybody else. So the next day I got on the train and in Kings Mountain, North Carolina, and came to Washington, D.C. Now I had two sisters living in Washington, so that was in my favor. And I showed up, and my brother-in-law said, "Oh, you came to get a job?" And I said, "No, I came to go to college." And of course that meant we had another mouth to feed, but the extended family was very important. And so the next day I got on the streetcar and went up to Howard, and went to the registrar's office, and they told me, they said, "School has been in session for 3 weeks. You can't just come to college. You got to be in session." And I said, "Well, I'm here, give me one." I had my report card, I was class salutatorian, so why not? I could make up those 3 weeks. And they said, no, you can't just walk in like that. And I paid them no attention. I went ahead and sat in on class. I always say I was the first to sit in on, not the people in Greensburg. But anyway, make a long story short, my teachers were kind. They knew I wasn't properly enrolled, but they never said leave. And most importantly, when I'm at Howard University speaking now, I say, of course, now that I graduated and taught there and all of that, I say, well, thank God for Howard. They didn't call security on me. So later on, they said, if you don't come back until, say, January, we were on the quarter system, we will make sure that you're properly enrolled. And they did. And so that was the beginning. And I enrolled as a history student, and later on became interested in pursuing art as a minor, and went over to the art building and took a course with Professor James Wells, the major graphic artist. And one day while I was working, Professor Porter came in and looked down on what I was doing, and he said, "I don't know your name, you're not major?" And I said, "No, I'm a history major." And he said, "Well, you don't belong over there, you belong here." So I went and changed my major.
So we actually are looking at a slide that has James Porter in the Howard University Gallery, as well as his foundational text, Modern Negro Art. How did Howard prepare you for the artist, scholar, and curator that you have become?
Well, I still say that HBCUs, and I know we have a number of people in the audience who are graduates of HBCUs. One of my former students, Professor Leland Ware, Fisk, and others there. They took great interest in preparing you for something beyond subject matter. They were interested in the whole person. So this whole concept of the arts being serviceably oriented in the humanities, it was very, very important. And so I came to Howard University at a time when the great luminaries, the great minds, were still there teaching. Alan Locke, Leo Hansberry, Lois Maynard Jones, James Porter, and so many others. And they took interest in their students by inviting them to their home. We got a pattern of seeing how they lived, their art that they lived with. And so when I became a professor at Talladega College in 1955, I tried to emulate that. And then when I left Talladega and went to Howard to teach in 1962, I would invite my students in, and my wife and I would prepare food for them. And some of them still say, we'd like to come and eat. Because my wife's daughter, she's a very good cook. When we had the dedication of the Driscoll Center at the University of Maryland back in 2007, one of the former students from Talladega College, who had been the provost at Howard University, Dr. Richard English, was one of the speakers. And he kind of revealed and let the secret out about the whole thing. He said, well, you know, Professor Driscoll assumed that we were all coming to his house to sit at his feet and learn. He said we were coming to eat. But much of the pattern of my teaching, of what I did later in life, was based on the kind of instruction that I got at Howard University, kind of information that was given to me. And I think that was true of most HBCUs. I tried to impart that same thing to the students when I went to Fisk to teach. University of Maryland was difficult because there wasn't a sense of community at a large university the way we were centered on campus at a small school like Fisk. And even Howard at that time, with 10,000 students, you could still be select in the 1960s. And some of the students who went on to great accord, Mary Lovelace O'Neill from the little town Tougaloo, Mississippi, who was an art major. And we were always into knowing who the students were, not so much by their work as by who they dated. And Mary dated Stokely Carmichael, the composer, and so many, and it was a great time at Howard University. And Howard University at that time was a real international university. I had students from India, Pakistan, from Greece, and all over. So what I learned from my teachers, I tried to pass it on to others.
So you arrive at Talladega, having finished your BFA, and I put a slide up here of a photograph of you in your cap and gown that you sent to your mother. It's in the Driscoll Center. And during this time, I put a few clues up there of the things that are happening in your life while you're also teaching studio art, mentoring students. You acquire property in Falmouth, Maine. You are the interim director at the Barnett Aiden Gallery, and you're finishing your MFA at Catholic University. So you're basically traveling for part of your years between Alabama, Washington, D.C., and Maine. And you begin a tradition under your direction of what you had experienced at Howard in terms of bringing exhibitions to the students. Could you talk a little bit about some of the exhibiting that you did at the students? I'm showing you two that were visiting exhibitions from the Guggenheim, but you also brought African art there. You brought work from African American artists to Alabama. That's something that you took from Howard and then you took it to Alabama.
Well, here again, I was relying on the information that I had learned, obtained from the program at Howard University when I was a student in the 1950s. And when Mr. James Johnson Sweeney, who was director of the Guggenheim Museum, came to Howard University in 1954, I want to say, to present an exhibition there, Modern Masters from the Guggenheim Museum. I was working as a student curator to Mr. Albert J. Carter, who was director of the Howard University Gallery. And of course, I met him, and graduating the next year, I kept in mind that this exhibition had come to Howard. Perhaps I can bring one such exhibition to Talladega College in Alabama. And so I wrote to Mr. Sweeney, and much to my surprise, he responded positively, and he said, we will be happy to lend X number of works to Talladega College. You want to know about the gallery? In those days, nobody worried about security and things like that. We didn't have any. He sent about 30 books from the Guggenheim Museum, and I published a little catalog. That was my first publication, Modern Masters from the Guggenheim Museum. And in that picture is a student at that time, Richard English, who later became Dr. English and provost at Howard and vice president at Howard University, retired recently. And we are there hanging a Kandinsky. Now, people in Alabama had never seen a Kandinsky because there was no such work of that caliber, particularly modern work, and in the museum. And the Birmingham Museum in Alabama had very, very few works that could even be considered modern. And in those days, the students, the black students could not go to the museum like the Birmingham Museum except one day a week. And I would take my students to Birmingham Museum, 44 miles away, on Tuesday, which was called Negro Day. And Negro Day was practiced not only at the Birmingham Museum, but at the High Museum, the Wallens Museum, you name it. That was standard American procedure. Thank God we're not there any longer. But one of the restrictions was the white students at the local, there were no local colleges nearby, Montebello College, King University, University of Alabama, and Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, etc. They were not permitted, not because Talladega didn't welcome them, but they were not permitted to come to a black institution. And so one of my colleagues over at Montebello, a white gentleman, he said, this is tyranny, cultural tyranny. He said, I'm going to bring my students anyway, but he said, I'll have to bring them at night. And so we opened the gallery for him to bring his white students. And of course, the word got out on his campus and they fired him. So that was the atmosphere. So this was our first exhibition. And thereafter, we started bringing African American artists and others to Talladega.
For the condition of the photograph, but I still wanted to show it to you. So in terms of the collection at Talladega in African art, so this was something also that you had seen at Howard, a kind of Catholic type of exhibiting. There was an African collection, but work was shown by African American artists as well as other American artists and European artists.
Yes, I wanted to have a whole diverse curriculum of exposure. And of course, I was aided by that, by a woman at the Harmon Foundation by the name of Mary Beatty Brady. And she had been director of that foundation since the 1920s. She liked me, and she would very often make special considerations to send things to me. She didn't like me, didn't get anything out of it. But luckily, she always supported me, and she was my first patron to send me to Europe to see the great monuments and the art of Europe in 1964.
This is a slide from a sketchbook a diary, visual diary. You've kept visual diaries throughout your life. This one I find particularly intriguing because it covers these particular years from teaching in Talladega, laying out the property that you have in Maine, but then also speaking to some of the issues. It has notes from lectures that you took at Catholic University as you're working on your MFA. But I chose two on the right that actually pertain to the protest and the sit-ins that were actually happening, and a way in which your diary tells your the whole person that you've been talking about. And I don't think people know much about the sit-ins and the protests that were actually taking place in Talladega. Here's a newspaper article from it. Here's James Foreman from CORE, a sketchbook that actually talks about the occupation of white churches on Easter Sunday. I'm wondering if you would like to talk a little bit about that, or even just how you choose the diary as a format to kind of respond.
Yeah, well, that was the age of protest, as you know. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama, and that says something big in the sense of social discord. But the students were very social-minded. Only 350 students at this little school, and yet they were very active. And we staged protests. We experienced elements of violence. The word got around. The Klan came on the campus and with random shooting about, so on and so on. So it was really a very difficult and unstable time. But we were there. We were willing to make the sacrifice, and I would take my sketchbook with me, and I think this was the first major sketchbook that I kept records with. And everywhere I went, I would sketch what was going on. And the art would be mixed in with it. There was no discrimination between the social and the cultural. And I was just looking at, like this became a marble, this bird became a marble bird. I don't know where it is now. I kept records of everybody's work except my own. I kind of curated everybody's work except my own. And that's okay. The sketches from the protests, the marches, and so forth and so on. When James Foreman, who was head of CORE, came and spoke at the local church in Talladega and so forth. So I would very quickly sketch things out, not thinking that these was that important, but I did keep these notes.
These are two works that you completed while you were actually living in Alabama, the Behold Thy Son and Blue Pines. I asked you recently where your studio was when you were teaching in Alabama. Where was your studio when you were teaching in Alabama?
I didn't have a designated studio per se. I actually worked in the back of the classroom where I taught. I was a one-person department. When I took the job, I was so happy to have a job. I went right out of my bachelor's degree at Howard University in 1955 to teaching on the college level. And that was kind of exceptional in a way. And I was so happy to have a job. I didn't worry about studio. There was a time when I painted part of the time at home. My wife and I had 2 little girls, and they'd get in the paint and sport all over the face.
This is when your studio was in the bathroom.
Right.
This was when your studio was in the bathroom?
Yes, it had the bathroom, not the studio at Howard. But at Talladega, there was enough space in the back of the painting room, which was also the graphic room, etc., for me to set up and paint. And nobody bothered anything, no locks on the door. And 1955, the death of Emmett Till, when he was murdered, it just took me by. I don't know how I felt. I couldn't deal with it socially. And it was this kind of hurt feeling for so long. So in 1956, I decided to do a painting. I did a series of sketches and whatever. And I did a painting in which I was trying to recall that moment of the cross when Jesus says to Mary, you know, woman, behold thy son. Look back, look and see what they've done. Because that's what Mrs. Till was saying when she had the open casket. Look, see what they did to my son. And so this was a painting for me which was really cathartic in certain ways because it was cleansing. I was really being eaten up by that kind of remorse and that kind of hate. So I did this painting and then put it away. It may have been exhibited once. Then I put it away for years. And I left it at Talladega when I left. And some 30 or more years later, one of my former students, a colleague, called me and he said, do you realize you left X number of paintings in the closet? And he said, you know, they don't belong to us, but so I said, keep the watercolors, but send me the Behold That Sign. And so he did. And this, the people at the National Museum of African American History and Culture saw it and came by and purchased it. And then at Alabama, a couple years later, I just decided that I couldn't deal with painting people anymore. So I said, I'll just paint landscape, I'll paint trees. I had been to Skowhegan up in Maine, and I had beautiful pine trees and what have you. And I had started working on my thesis at the Catholic University of America. And my subject, I got my teacher to approve my subject of working on pine trees as a symbol of eternity. And so I started the pine series down in Talladega. I started my graduate work in 1958. And this series came, and I'm still painting pines. But they too were cathartic for me in the sense that here's a beautiful subject in nature that I could relate to, that there was no confrontation, there was nothing wrong with that. And so the pine became a symbol of my own endurance in that sense.
Talladega, you go back to Howard as a professor, later acting chairman of the department overseeing the art gallery. And you are still working for the Barnett Aiden Gallery. Right? And you finished your MFA. And so there's a brief interlude where you're back at Howard. And you're painting, still painting pines, but you also begin to turn to these large paintings that are dealing with more Christological subject matter. Jonah and the Whale, Angel Gabriel.
Well, even though I was painting the pines and started moving back to religious subjects, I was And the religious subjects were based principally on the kind of fundamentalist sermons that my father preached in the Baptist church. As a kid, I would sit there and visualize Jonah and this whale. The last of all requiems, Gabriel blowing the trumpet. So many other subjects that really didn't materialize until I learned how to deal with iconography and subject matters such as Jonah and the whale. By that time, I was a professor at Howard University. And so a number of the subjects are religious in that sense. But I was also experimenting with other forms of modernism. And to me, this was a very important period in my painterly pursuit, because it was a chance for me to combine the rhetoric of of what I had learned as a kid, the stories from the Bible, with my own contemporary expression. Well, and I'll point out, in reference to my father saying, the way out of this is through education. When I was 5 years old, and I had 3 sisters ahead of me, and when I was 5 years old, when I was in the 5th grade, my father gave me a book to read. Now, he was a fundamentalist Baptist preacher, but he gave me this book to read called Basic Teachings of the Great Philosophers. And I read it because he gave it to me, and he would say, if you read it and commit to memory and so forth and so on, I give you a quarter. And he would also say that about certain scriptures in the Bible. You memorize the first Psalm, I'll give you a quarter. So he didn't realize the next morning I was repeating, blessed is the man who walketh not in the counsel of the godly, and the whole thing, my quarter. So some of that was his urging of me to explore my own intellectual life on that limited basis. We couldn't go to a public library. Black folk weren't permitted to go to the library. Occasionally, we could have a friend check out a book for us and bring it that way. So there's always he would always say, there's always a ram in the bushes, the biblical phrase. So there's always a way around that, and he was helping to perfect that. So this whole notion of bringing the subjects back, what I heard as a kid, was a part of this.
Fisk University in Nashville, where you were for a decade, expanded the department, curated several exhibitions. It's during that time that 2 centuries of Black American art actually happened. You take your first trip to Africa. You create a larger department than was actually there. This image of you in your studio, your office, is striking in comparison with the one at Howard University. So for you, what was that transition like, and how did you get to Fisk? The transition from Howard to Fisk.
I'm sorry, the last part.
How did you get to Fisk from Howard?
I'll go back to our good friend, Miss Brady at the Harvard Foundation, who was a dear friend of Aaron Douglas. And Aaron Douglas was about to retire from teaching at Fisk. He'd been there since 1939. He did the murals at Fisk in 1931, but he started teaching in 1939, and was a one-person department, like I was at Talladega, pretty much. And so I'd known about Mr. Douglas and his work and what have you, from the Harlem Renaissance and all, but I had not met him until the 1960s. And so Miss Brady insisted I should accept the invitation to go to Fisk and lecture at the Fine Arts Festival, and that was in April of 1966, and that was my first time meeting Mr. Douglas face to face. And he then said to me, I'm retiring at the end of the school year, and I really think you ought to consider coming to Fisk. And I was like, Fisk? I'm at Howard. Why would I want to come down to this little school? And then, of course, when I looked around and saw the richness of this institution, his murals were there, the special collection in the library, which is really second to none. It's like a little Schoenberg. And so I had second thoughts about it, and of course Miss Brady was saying, look, you could go to Fisk and build on that tradition that Douglas had, and it would really be great. And so they kind of made me an offer that I couldn't refuse by doubling my salary from Howard. So I went down, and they really gave me a chance to build upon the tradition that I had learned about at Howard, of Porter, of Herring, of Wells, of Louis Jones and others. And I brought in various artists who were, you know, the visiting artists. They gave me a chance to have a visiting artist series. Walter Williams was one of the first visiting artists that I brought in. He had been my roommate at Skowhegan in 1953. I brought in Jacob Lawrence in 1968 for the opening of the Toussaint Louverture series. And so I had a chance to exercise my own intellectual pursuit there. And I still say it in the presence of my Howard colleagues in ways that I could not have done at Howard.
And just going to go back to this for a second. You do make your first visit to the continent of Africa, traveling on a fellowship, and then you spend part of January as a visiting professor at the University of Ife. And you are actually lecturing on African American art in Nigeria, right? So how did that experience in your first trip to West Africa in particular, how did that affect or enter back into your own teaching and thinking when you go back to Fisk?
Well, I'll preface that by saying I had taken courses at Howard University in African art history and African history, period. I mean, Howard was the place in the 1950s and even prior for those kinds of studies. We had Leo Hansberry there teaching, African history and so many other luminaries. And so I had Africa in my blood, so to speak, beyond the physical. I had it in my blood from the point of view of the intellectual pursuit. The images I was familiar with. And so I didn't get to go to Africa personally until 1969, for the first time. And so I went various places, and the invitation was to come to the University of Ife, the new name now of the university. Yes, okay, you can pronounce it, I can. So I went there assuming that I was going to be teaching daily. And they said, no, a professor doesn't teach daily. And a professor lectures occasionally. So there I was all this time, and I was expected to give 3 lectures the whole time I was there. And but a part of that, it gave me a chance to travel, to go out and meet so many other artists. I had already met Ben Nwangu, Solomon Bolger, and so many other artists who had come to the States. But there I had a chance to go to their settings, to their home, and went to Benin and had a chance to meet the Oba. I had read about this experience of the Oba, the British coming there in 1897, deposing the Oba and taking so much of the art back to England. And so it was an experience of a lifetime. And so I went there as a visiting professor. And this was, of course, one of the lectures that I gave. And I would save everything all the posters, the letters, the notes, the photographs and what have you, not with the notion that they were going to be important. But after I studied in Holland in 1964, studied art history at the Netherlands Institute for the History of Art, your stomping ground in The Hague, and I would go to the archive and see the diligence with which the people worked. The ladies would sit there and cut out newspaper clippings and put them in files. Hey, somebody's going to use this later. So when I came back, I started doing that. And so I would keep everything. This is a poster from Ethan. And letters of exchange. My letters from Robert Beard, from Jacob Lawrence, Mayor Douglas, all. And of course they end up eventually at the Driscoll Center in the archive where one can see them. So this was an experience that was very important in helping me to not only visualize my relationship to African art, but to actually see it in person. And it helped to eliminate the notion that some people felt that just because you had African blood in your vein, you could do African art. It doesn't work that way. Because this is a serviceably oriented art. It was in the service of the people. It wasn't just graphic alone. It was spiritual. And people couldn't be born without it. They couldn't live without it, and they couldn't die without it. And for us, it's something on the wall.
Working at a time, so there were sit-ins and protests when you were at Talladega, but you were also working at Fisk during the height of the Black Arts Movement, the Black Panther Movement. It's still a very turbulent era in the U.S., and Fisk, as a campus, was also responding to violence in Nashville. And I just wanted to show two of the works that were created from a Ghetto Wall series that you started while you were at Fisk University, just to give a greater sense to those of you who come today of the openness of his working and painting style. And both of these are probably, especially the work on the right that's in Birmingham, at that museum you just were recently talking about, that is a collage painting that becomes really your métier. So in some ways, you became the artist that you would be for a lifetime at Fisk. Right?
Yes, I had a chance to be selective about the courses I taught at Fisk, even though I chaired the department and I was also directing the art gallery. But they all went hand in hand in a certain way. And Fisk was good to me in that sense, that I could in the summers, I'd still go to Maine and paint. But I had it was the only place I'd ever been where, to teach, where I was provided a studio. So on the third floor of Valentine Hall, I had my studio. And I was very productive because I was young, I was productive. I could go there and I'd work till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Don't do that anymore. And I was beginning to see the new scope of American art, period, and where it was going, how the African American experience fitted into that. And so the assemblage, in this case, I found out, I started incorporating and found out that people said, oh, you're looking at Rauschenberg. I said, no, I'm not looking at Rauschenberg. I didn't even know about it until late. But, you know, there were people using found objects, Joseph Carnell and so many even long before Rauschenberg was born. So I was looking at the scope of things. And then the collage, which had always fascinated me. And as a student of art at Howard University in the 1950s, Lois Mailou Jones would have us do collages, some of which I still have little studies. She would have us doing with construction paper and what have you. So it wasn't a new medium. But then along comes this great American master who projects the collage and pushes it into another dimension. Romare Bid. And I got to know him. and I would go visit him. He would come and he visited us in Nashville and so forth. And so I started pattering what I was doing after him as a mentor. And one thing he said to me was, he said, be careful about the kind of photographs you use in your collages. And he said that he had stopped using certain photographs because these were somebody else's works of art. And if you didn't get permission from them, they could question your use of those. So I started then tearing up old prints of my own work. So this is really the faces of print of mine, and reinserting them. A piece of woodcut here, woodcut there, and then other pieces torn and what have you. So it was an experimental process for me, but at the same time, it was a very rewarding one, because he then said to me, because I had started trying to imitate what he was doing, and he said, here he said, at the show I did in New York in 1980, he said, I appreciate the fact that you appreciate me enough to give me that kind of credit. He said, but you want to hear your own voice. So I started tearing mine instead of cutting it. And that's how a lot of this came about.
So we were looking at this earlier. I just wanted to remind folks here that the Delaware Art Museum has a work that they acquired of yours on the left, which is based on the homage piece, the collage piece, Night Vision for Jacob Lawrence. I'm not sure if it's out, but I know that Heather has written about it, but certainly something to look at when it does come out. So Jacob Lawrence is here, second from the left, and then Aaron Douglas. You were talking about the collection at Fisk. Arne Bontemps was hugely significant for the Harlem Renaissance literature that was collected at Fisk.
I might say Douglas had some wonderful connections to Wilmington.
That's right, he does.
Yeah, because he had friends here, and he would very often come and spend time with them.
And there's an Aaron Douglas in the collection here too. So Fisk became what the images show here, and just I'll show you a few in a row. Fisk became very much a place for you to map out a history of African American art and showing work by contemporary artists in ways that prepared you, I think, for 2 centuries of African American art. At a traveling exhibition, I saw Delaware with a couple of catalogs from 2 centuries out there, just to give you a sense of the scope of where the exhibition traveled. That started in 1976 at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. But what few people know is that this didn't just arise from nowhere, right? It came from a history of exhibitions that you curated before that. Here's a comment where you basically say you already had it in your head before you were actually asked. I could have never done it had I not had 25 years of research before then. I knew what I wanted, what the key pieces would be. The format was very clear to me. It was kind of a dream that I had for many years, but I put together several small shows at Fisk of the past 10 years, and one for the United Church in Harlem, which toured in 1975, that gave me the basis. And I'm wondering, so that one that was at the United Church in Harlem, just a couple of the other exhibitions that predate the 2 centuries of African American art, a catalog on the left of one of the many exhibitions that you curated at Fisk University, one that you curated in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1968. Amistad, which also came to Philadelphia. I don't know if any of you are of the age where you could have actually seen it. This is the exhibition that also predates 2 centuries of African American art, 1975, that came out of Fisk. Here's an image of it showing at the library, in Washington, D.C., the Martin Luther King Public Library. Most of these spaces, though, were black spaces, black exhibition spaces. So 2 centuries of black American art was different.
Yes.
Yeah. So can you talk about that movement from curating for, here's when it was at in Philadelphia, curating 2 centuries of African American art as a traveling exhibition that would then go to what really were largely white institutions at that time.
Two exhibition preceded the 2 centuries exhibition, but in a certain way it was the format of what I wanted to do on a smaller scale. And it was a smaller exhibition, of course, and it led itself to smaller galleries and to places like libraries and small African American exhibition spaces. And here, as you said, the public library in the District of Columbia. But it went to numerous places around the country that the 2 centuries exhibition obviously could not have gone because of its size and the time.
Can you, because I am mindful of our time, can you talk about curating as activism in the sense that we are here also today celebrating Posing Beauty and Deborah Willis's work, but certainly the enormous impact that your work as a curator has had, let's go back to 2 centuries, has had as a foundational text. Probably, I don't know how conscious you were when you were thinking about the evolution of it, and then how do you look back on that today?
Well, I was not cognizant of what really was going to happen with reference to this exhibition as a page setter of 2 centuries. And as you said, going to, in this case, all mainstream white institutions over and against where Amistad went. But I think the larger audience in these places laid the groundwork for museum directors to see that there was a body of material, a body of work out there that even they weren't familiar with, that was as good or better than some of the things they were showing. So it became kind of a pace setter in that regard. And I had no notion that this catalog would become kind of a model for study. I was doing it based on my own research, on my own interests. And so then to have it show up at these major institutions gave it validity that it would not have had by, say, being at some of the, even at a historically black institution. So this then becomes one of the research tools that people use. And I think, to a certain extent, one of the means by which I met you as a scholar who became interested in the African American experience.
Eve, almost really, Christmas Eve and New Year's, you and your family depart Fisk University. This is a party for you that's being held. And I'm thinking that that might actually be a catalog of 2 centuries that you might be signing there. But then you moved to the University of Maryland, College Park. And I brought you all this photo today because it shows a dress that David Driscoll painted for Thelma Driscoll, which is now in the collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So the move from Fisk University to the University of Maryland, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, as you say, this was a kind of a going away party at Fisk University in Jubilee Hall in December of 1976. Everybody knew that I was coming to Maryland in January of '77. And so the community turned out in big numbers, a great send-off. And as you said, my wife was wearing a dress that she designed because she used to sew quite a bit, and that I hand painted. And as you say, it's now in the collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. We were down visiting the museum recently, and my wife, who can be very folksy at times, said, "Where's my dress?" Of course, obviously, it just can't be on view all the time. And so I came to Maryland in January 1977, and my responsibility there was not just to be the teacher at large, but to literally organize courses in African American art history, because there'd been no such courses in the history of that department. And so I had taught these courses at Fisk and Howard, what have you. So all I had to do was to kind of revise my syllabus, update it, and bring it into contemporary times. But I also taught a course called Methods and Materials of Painting, which I had learned from the paint master himself, Leonard Bocour, the great paint manufacturer, when I was his assistant at Skowhegan School. So in that course, at both Howard, Fisk, and Maryland, I taught fresco painting, ink tempera, a number of media that one normally doesn't deal with, the old media, so to speak. And you see students there from my classes. This was a fresco demonstration that I did in 1978, I want to say. Students in the various classes there. And my colleague would say, and I limit the class, they allowed me to limit the class to about 12 people, which was not bad for a big university. And my colleague would say, "Are you still teaching that luxury course?" Because it wasn't easy to get into it. I would interview the students before they signed up. If they weren't serious, no, don't hinder those who are. We go out into the countryside, dig clays like umbers, ochres, etc., and bring them back and grind them and make them into paintable materials, things like that. So, of course, when I retired,
An exhibition that opened at the Studio Museum in Harlem. How did 2 centuries open up in some ways or change your curatorial mandate, if at all?
well, I think, as you said, 2 centuries had kind of laid the groundwork for this kind of research. And a number of the scholars that you see listed there, Laurie Stokes and Deborah Willis and all say, well, we wouldn't be doing this if you hadn't started it. Well, I don't know about that. I think it would.
It's true.
And so these exhibitions did kind of give them a format to see what was possible. I recall 1992, I was out in Chicago lecturing at the University of Chicago Circle campus, and Deb Willis introduced me, and she said, "I'm introducing my mentor." And at the same session was Carrie Weems, the great photographer, artist, speaker. Carrie got up, she said, "Well, he's my mentor too." So I've had the good fortune of being claimed by so many of the wonderful greats, you know. I recruited Sharon Patton to come to the University of Maryland. I recruited Keith Morrison to come to the University of Maryland. Worked with Ann Gibson when she was at the University of Delaware, and with Henry Druell, who's just now retiring from teaching African art history at University of Wisconsin. And so many people that they're not my mentees. I've learned from them, just as they say they've learned from me. But this is a list of people who many continue to work in the field.
The gifts that you have given us, but we haven't discussed at all the fact that he is a gardener in Maryland and in Maine, that it is also very much an artistic practice, and that it's about nurturing the field in a different way. This idea of conjuring both a field that is productive exists both in nature and in terms of your practice as an artist and as an art historian and curator. So I'm wondering, before we open it up to the audience, if there are things that
doing, not thinking that later these things were going to be of influence to me. And very often when you see these little sprigs, and somebody asked me up in Maine when I was lecturing this summer, said, what's that plant? I said, oh, arugula. It could be anything, but it could be anything. But it's there to celebrate the legacy of my mother, who taught us. Well, my sisters weren't that interested in it, but I would follow around in the woods everywhere she went. Like, why are you getting this? This is full of coal. Why are you getting this? This is for so and so and so. And I still use some of those things in my 88th year for the kind of cook with them, make cough syrup, all of these different things that I learned down there in the mountains. And here you see me in the garden this year in Maine, picking peaches, and people say, peaches grow in Maine? I say, yeah, if you let them. And my little acreage there, I have peaches, grapes, pears, apples, plums, you name it, plus my vegetable garden. And I tend to all of that lovingly, because they give us something very special. And I don't leave Maine until I pick my pears. This 2 weeks ago, I picked 2 bushels of pears. And my nephew, who helps take care of me, and my art manager, he drove them all back down to Maryland, and of course, to the disgust of my wife, having to peel all those pears. But we, in a certain way, we live partly on the land. The land gives us so much. It gives us the sense of knowing a vision of the one, the true and the beautiful. It also gives us the sustenance by which we live. And so, for me, nature is always one with what I do, because it's parcel of my history, my current interest, and hopefully I will continue to have that kind of interest.
Just before it's being seated, could you tell me more about your experience with the Barnett Aiken collection, first as a resident of the gallery and then as interim director, please?
Yes. Around 1952, as a student at Howard University, trying to make ends meet. Had a family. My wife and I had one child at that time, late 1952. And so I was working at the Barnett Aiken Gallery part-time with Mr. Alonzo Hayden and Professor Herring, helping to hang paintings, to place them in the proper perspective and storage and things like that. I didn't consider myself a curator, but I was learning, because I was learning from the masters. And so I worked there for about two years, and it was there that I met. In those days, they would have these gatherings that were like salons, and famous people who came into town would always come to the Barnett Aiken Gallery. This was the gallery which was started by Alonzo J. Aiken, an African-American curator, the first African-American to really be professionally trained as a major curator. He attended the Albany Institute of Art in New York, and he started in Berlin, in the 30s and so forth. And I think in the Driscoll, in the archive, the Driscoll Center, in the one of the folders, either Professor Herring or Mr. Aiden, from the Bernard Aiden Gallery, there's a letter that Mr. Aiden gave me when I was working there with the envelope. He was studying in Germany in 1936. You know, that was a difficult time because of the rise of Hitler and all of that. And he wrote back to Professor Herring to tell him about his experience there. And the swastika stamp on that letter, the little piece of history in a certain way. But Mr. Aiden gave me a chance to see what was possible with what might be referred to as a private gallery, as a community project. And so I worked there for a number of years, and I met important artists who would come into town, like Robert Beard, Jacob Lawrence, Theodore Stavis, Iris Barrera, people like that I would not have met otherwise. And of course the local poets and what have you, because when they would have a salon, they would come and read and recite and things. So it was quite an important creative atmosphere. So that gallery was really major in the city of Washington from 1943 until 1960, because Mr. Aiden died in 1961. In that this was the only place where you could see African-American art in its fullness other than at the gallery at Howard University. And Mr. Aiden had been a curator at Howard. So it was that kind of symbiotic relationship.
This isn't a question. This is a thank you. Thank you for this, for sure. Thank you for the mentorship that you provided to Leland and me. I think we started our journey with understanding ourselves and surrounding ourselves with the art of our people because of you and because of your mentorship with him when he was a student at Fisk University. I got my first copy of this in 1977 during the opening of the exhibit at the High Museum in Atlanta. I was off maybe 22 or 23, so I sat next to plants in my home, and when I watered the plants, it got some water on it. And so I got another copy because, Mr. Driscoll, I will not have the only copy of this wonderful volume have water stains on it, but I need you to sign it again. So either today or when we visit you next in May, okay, we don't have time today, we'll see you again very soon. But thank you. I think the Walter Williams that we had, was that a gift from Mr. Driscoll? Oh, well, we bought it from Mr. Driscoll, but he challenged us at that moment.
Before deep discount.
But he challenged us at that moment to take care of it and told us that at some point he would visit our home to see what we've done with it. So you still need to make that visit, all right?
I look forward to it.
Thank you.
When Leland came to, we had a dinner together with Janice Dyer
Oh, yes,
in
absolutely.
1977.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
In Atlanta.
Exactly.
At the High.
Exactly. And we still see them all. They were all of them were his students. Janice Darden Frank became a noted artist on Martha's Vineyard, and we have several of her pieces in our homes as well.
As did Lois Jones. But they would always say to us, if you want people to be supportive of you, say with the beginning of our collection was given to us. It was a beautiful canvas print that was given to us as a wedding gift by Professor James B. Herring. And of course, we kind of treated Professor Herring as though he was not only a mentor, but almost like the father to us. And so when we moved to Washington in 1962 from Talladega, I had the audacity to say to Professor Herring, do you think you could help us get a loan to buy a house. We were living in his house at that time, because he had gone to Talladega to teach in my place, you know. And he said, "No, I'm not your dad." He said, "Sell that Kandinsky." And I did, and I'm sorry that I did. Because a year or so later, I went to the Guggenheim Museum, and there was the same print on the wall. And I said, "Oh, wow, okay." But I had a home. And that was the beginning of our collection. Then I bought a work from James Wells and a few others. And then I started buying art books. And one of the first art books that I bought in 1952 was Lois Jones' book, Pictures. She had self-published it. And of course I had to buy it because I wouldn't have gotten out of her class without buying it. But I'm glad I bought it because it's a major collector's work now. So we began collecting, and I often say, taking milk out of our little kid's mouth, buying art. But now, at the same time, some of that art has helped with their kids going to college. We didn't buy it for investment purposes, but that's an angle that, you know, we want to consider as well.
Your 200 years show, it's the same year I graduated high school, and I grew up on the edge of Harlem in New York City, so I had a lot of interesting childhood. But anyway, I wonder if you could quickly say how you came to be invited from starting out at a small level to doing such a blockbuster that went to these major museums, number one. And number two, as a former museum professional, I would say, why are we still playing catch up in museums for owning and acquiring African American art 40, 50 years after your incredible exhibition? The Bristol Center is doing a great job. Other museums are doing a great job, but these are still in the minority. And I privately buy and sell art, and the museums I work for are now focusing very strongly on catch-up.
I'll just kind of comment on that in the sense of the lineage of the history you're talking about. When I started teaching these courses, like I said, when I arrived at the University of Maryland in 1977, there were no courses in African American art history. We had, it wasn't an easy time getting it into the curriculum because it was not considered standard, but there were enough students across racial lines who were interested at that time in the subject that they had to acquiesce and say, yes, this is an important part. But the important thing is my chairman had recruited me there, Dr. George Levitine, had recruited me there with a specific notion in mind that I was going to develop a curriculum in African American art history. And so he gave me that chance. And then a year later when he stepped down from the chair and I became chairman, we were able to not only add the undergraduate studies, but add studies on the master's level and eventually on the PhD level. And so, adjacent to all of what you've said is the fact that this subject was not commonplace in museums around the country. It has become much more widespreadly done today because of the interest in diversity and because of the paucity of literature in the field and what have you. It's added to the canon of American art. So institutions such as University of Maryland, University of Delaware, etc., are increasingly adding to the compendium by making sure that this becomes a very vital part of the American canon.
Your
Blackness show. How were you invited to do that?
I was teaching at Fisk University at the time, and I understand there were discussion about what would be the bicentennial exhibition. And there was an organization called the Black Arts Council at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, on which a former classmate of mine, Mrs. Aurelia Brooks, Howard University, served. Charles White was on it, Dr. Samela Lewis, and several others, Dr. Leon Banks, etc. All of whom were either collectors of African American art or were interested in the subject. And they brought the subject to the attention of the board, and there wasn't much excitement about it. Like, what is there to show? And so, I understand quite a number of people came through with proposals, and finally, I got a call from Charles White, and he said, he never called me David, he said Driscoll, always said Driscoll. He said, Driscoll, you need to come out here and teach these people something about black art. And that's, you know, where Charlie talked. And he said, I'm going to see if we can't get you invited. He said, we've had Australian people come through here. He says, but I've told them, if they want to do a major exhibition and want to do it right, they're going to have to, number one, get somebody from the East. He said, because we don't know what's going on out here. He said, and secondly, they're going to have to get somebody who has been involved in the field. And so he asked if I would consider coming if they invited me. And I said, yes. So I didn't realize when I got there, I got, you know, a proposal out, about 12 or 15 pages or so, what I would do, what I would include. And then I learned that there had been a number of people ahead of me who had made proposals. I thought I was the only one going out. And I thought, no, you know, I'm the last one. And so I presented my proposal to the board. There was one African American person, Mr. Robert Wilson, a businessman, on the board of the LA County Museum at that time. He was a collector. And he's still alive. He's around 97 years old. And he gave a very passionate speech about why. And everybody listened. And there was the question and answer period. And Mrs. Golden, the Metro Golden Mayor, was on the board. I don't remember her first name, but she said to me, she said, Professor Driscoll, I've listened to your presentation. I see what you presented to us. She said, I'm Jewish. She said, but I would not want to present an exhibition of Jewish art in 1976 for the American Bicentennial. And so I said, well, Mrs. Golden, no offense, but I know you know your culture better than I. But I know it well enough to know that Jewish people have always been in the vanguard of American culture. I said, I was sent to school partially by a Jewish couple from Greenbelt, Maryland. And I said, one of the most important things in their life was art. I said, so I know you know your history, but there would be no need. I said, I studied with Jewish people, Jack Levine, Morris Lewis, etc., etc. I said that there is a lack of information, of knowledge about what Africa and the world, we're saying black artists, have done, how they have contributed to the field. And this exhibition will be educational, not only for black people, but for everybody. And it will be there to help redefine and become a revisionist approach to the American art canon. So, that's what African American art is still doing. It's not a separate movement. It shouldn't be looked upon as something different and special. It's American from the core. And it's a part of the larger definition of what culture is about in this country. That's what I've devoted my life to saying and doing.
Dr. Driscoll, my name is Harlan McCary. I'm over here in this Mandela shirt. I hope that I would have this opportunity to publicly express my appreciation to you for coming into the Goins house at the time you were receiving an honorary doctorate degree from the University of Delaware. And to view the Aaron Douglas mural, the Haitian mural. I am not an artist, art historian, art anything, except that I just feel that our art is an important part of our culture. I did not have a chance to tell you, and I'll just take 30 seconds. My interest in the mural really came about because my great aunt was the cook for the Goins family and remembers Aaron Douglas visiting their home and serving him. And she spoke so kindly about how kind a man, how nice a man, how respectful he was. And that's how I got introduced to that mural. I asked you a question back then. I'm almost afraid to ask it now because your question inspired me to try to develop at that site a small African-American art gallery. Dr. Driscoll, your response to my question was instrumental in buttressing my thoughts about this house being made into a gallery. I asked you, do you think that this would be an appropriate site to establish a small gallery, a small African-American art gallery? And you said yes. Now, I've been about the business of trying to do that, and I'm almost afraid to ask you this question because we are about 30 days or so away from opening the first level of the Loper Douglas Gallery of African American Art at the Goins house. Is there still a role for small galleries like the one that we're about to open?
Well, I recall the effort earlier to get the house set aside for that purpose. And I wasn't kept abreast of what was going on, and I don't know the history of it since I was last here. However, I would simply say that knowing the relationship that Professor Douglas had with the Goins, the kind of patronage that they gave him, the support, the effort to help promote his art, I would say that it indeed would be a respectable and most enlightening thing to do, is to preserve that kind of relationship, be it as an art gallery, an art center, an art forum, or what have you, in the sense that it speaks to the concept of community, cultural community, which we never have enough chance to expand upon. And certainly the Goins played an important role in his development, in Douglas' development. So it's the kind of thing that would be welcomed addition to, as far as I'm concerned, to community efforts to preserve that aspect of our culture.
Thank you, Dr. Driscoll, for your extraordinary gifts to us and for your time today at the Delaware Museum.